Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to what has inadvertently turned out to be the first in this year's Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series. For those of you who attempted to come to Michael Munger's lecture a couple of weeks ago, we are at work on trying to reschedule that, though whether it will be this year or next, I don't know. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies and the director of the Jan P. Lind Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, of which RGCS is a part. RGCS brings together students, postdoctoral fellows, visiting faculty, and regular faculty in political theory and political philosophy, legal theory and legal philosophy, public law and constitutional law, and constitutional level social science, especially political science, for study on the fundamental institutions that shape the rules and norms governing political societies and normative inquiry into those rules. The RGCS lecture series aims to bring in outside scholars in those fields and who can speak to those fields. Scholars who represent the social sciences, philosophy, law, and history, and who are able to speak in a way that is broadly accessible to a student audience on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society. The lecture series is the primary undergraduate focused project of the Lind Center and of RGCS, and was organized partly out of a conviction that there's an unfortunate segregation between the world of research faculty traveling around the world to speak to research faculty and graduate students, and the world of, well, speakers who are brought to campus to talk with undergraduates who are all too often not very serious researchers and not very good teachers. Very good researchers are very often excellent teachers, and we aim to bring in serious researchers who are able to talk in the way that very good research teachers are able to talk about actual research and actual advances in the social sciences, philosophy, history, and law, in ways that can enrich our conversation in the political theory-centered community that is RGCS. The Jan Lind Center, it has a broader remit. It is dedicated to the humanistic social sciences, to normative, historical, comparative inquiry across the social sciences, spanning a number of faculties and more than 10 departments across McGill. The next big event in the Lind Center will be tomorrow, when Stephen Pincus, professor of history at the University of Chicago, will speak on the history of the British Empire through 1788, thinking about global imperial history as a whole. That talk will be between 2 and 4 p.m. in Thompson House. And the next event in the RGCS lecture series will be 2 weeks from today in Thompson House, when Helena Rosenblatt from the City University of New York and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York will talk on Benjamin Constant, Germaine de Staël, and the foundations of liberalism. For today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Kimberly Clausing. Kimberly Clausing is the Thormund Miller and Walter Mintz Professor of Economics at Reed College, where she teaches international trade, international finance, and public finance. Her research studies the taxation of multinational firms. She's published numerous articles in this area, and she's the author of Open, the Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. Professor Clausing has received 2 Fulbright Research Awards, and her research has been supported by external grants from the National Science Foundation, the Smith Richardson Foundation, the International Center for Tax and Development, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. She's worked on economic policy research with the IMF, the Hamilton Project, the Brookings Institution, the Tax Policy Center, and has testified before both the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Committee on Finance in the United States. She received her BA from Carleton College and her PhD from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Clausing.
Thank you, Jacob, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be at McGill to talk about these ideas. Jacob said I should speak for about 50 minutes, so there should be a half hour for Q&A and conversation at the end. So today I'm going to talk about our current moment in economic history and why it is that I view nationalistic economic policy to be completely upside down from what would be the ideal response to this moment. And let me start by mentioning that I put workers at the center of this conversation. So my objective is to sort of make sure that workers and households are well off. And to give you the punchline first, my argument in this book, which is the one Jacob referenced, is that the ideal policies from workers' perspective would be open economic policies, free trade, more immigration, access to global capital, coupled with a strong progressive tax system and a strong safety net. I view the opposite set of policies as very misguided and unnecessarily blaming of foreigners for our economic troubles. Those instincts, I believe, are counterproductive, especially when coupled with regressive social policies. So that's going to be the main argument, just to give you the thesis first so you can watch for it. Okay, so let me start by what's been going on for workers, and I won't confine my attention to just the United States. I'm going to put in some Canada facts and also facts from around the world. And then we'll talk about the role of globalization, then we'll talk about policy. So first, in recent decades, there's often been a discrepancy between what's going on with the big macroeconomic indicators, things like GDP and GDP per capita, and what's been going on for typical workers. This is particularly true in the United States. That discrepancy is particularly big, but you can see that pattern visible in many countries. And part of the reason for that discrepancy between the growth in the economy and relatively more stagnant situations for typical workers is because the capital share of income is rising, and typical households and workers don't happen to own a lot of capital, right? At the same time, governments have sort of turbocharged some of these trends by cutting taxes for capital and raising more of the fiscal burden from workers and labor in the form of labor income taxes or consumption taxes. Beyond that trend, there's been a second set of trends concerning the increasing concentration of both capital and labor income. And if you look at the World Inequality Database, which I encourage you to go take a squint at, you can actually get distributional data from lots of different countries. And you'll find that in the United States is one of the sort of worst in terms of increasing income inequality, but it's certainly not alone. There are lots of other countries that have actually really quite similar patterns, and I went actually and looked at Canada just to compare, and you do see, of course, increasing income inequality in Canada, as you're well aware. What's kind of interesting is comparing Canada to the United States, the big difference seems to be the top 1%, right? So the top 1% is 20% of income in the United States and 13% in Canada. So it's a very big difference. But if you look at the top 10% of the population, they have 41% of the income in Canada and 46% in the United States. So actually the share of income received by the second to 9th or 10th percentile from the top perspective is actually slightly higher in Canada than in the United States, but that top 1% is really important in the United States. But this surging income inequality helps explain why it is that you can have so much economic growth, but yet not necessarily feel it for the typical worker or the typical person. So this is a really important phenomena, and I kind of put that at the center of the inquiry, but then the first thing to ask is, well, what caused that? Because this seems to be a trend that basically started in about 1980 and has continued to present day. But if you look at the period before that, if you look at the post-World War II period to 1980, you actually see the opposite, with much stronger growth for typical workers than for those at the top. So there was kind of wage compression in many countries of the world during that period. Whereas it's become more unequal lately. So I identify 6 causal factors that might be contributing to this. One is globalization, and that's the one we're going to focus on most today. With globalization, you have more competition from abroad, and that can heighten some of these trends that we've just talked about, and we're going to return to that one. But I wanted to point out a bunch of other factors that are really important drivers of the economic situation kind of throughout the world, and foremost among these is technological change. If you look at the the role of computers and the internet, and even more basic innovations like mechanization of the assembly line and things like that. That technological change has been very dramatic, and it's systematically reduced the demand for the labor of people who are not college educated relative to the labor of people who are college educated. So you should be happy that you're you're getting your college educations, because you'll be in the set of people who still have high labor demand. But this has happened throughout the world, interestingly, not just in rich countries. It's also happened in poor countries. We've seen increased demand for those with skills and reduced demand for those without skills. In the United States, if you look at the manufacturing share of employment, it's been in steady decline since 1950. I just pulled up the Canadian data. It's nearly identical in terms of a declining manufacturing share of employment. And that share of employment and manufacturing is even declining in some countries that we would think of as quite a bit poorer than Canada and the United States. A second big change is there's been a big increase in market power. Companies are, on average, larger, more powerful, have more profits and more sales concentrated in just a few hands than was true a generation ago. And this is true across metrics. You know, you can look at different ways of measuring market power, but that concentration does seem to be there in almost all studies. And we can look at that either nationally, in the case of the United States, or you can also look at sort of global measures of market power, the share of worldwide sales that are made by the top firms, or the share of worldwide profits that are earned by the top firms. And if you look at those shares, those are also rising. So that's another big trend. The nature of labor markets has changed. They're far more competitive than they were a generation ago, and they're less unionized. If you look at OECD data, the typical rich country had about 1/3 of the workers unionized back in 1980, and that has fallen in half to being about 1/6 of workers now. Actually, Canada has a less dramatic trend, from 34% to 26%, so unionization has held up more in Canada. In the US, the numbers were smaller at the beginning and at the end of the period, 22% to 11%. So that's changed the sort of the balance of power between these increasingly concentrated companies and workers that are more competitive. Social norms, power and bargaining issues have also changed, and this is very country-specific in how it's changed. In the US, for instance, CEOs now earn 300 times what their typical workers earn. That's not true in a lot of other countries. And so the social norms, institutions of labor markets, and policy changes are highly variable across countries, and it's difficult to generalize. But in the countries that have seen the most increased income inequality have also been characterized by social norms that sort of are compatible with that. And finally, there have been important policy changes, and some of these are uniform across countries and some of them are more disparate. I would say the more uniform theme has been the tendency to reduce capital taxation. For instance, if you look at the corporate tax, the typical rich country had a corporate tax rate of 42% in 1980. Right now it's about half that. Canada's federal rate, by the way, is 15%, but if you add in the provincial layer, it's higher than that, because some provinces have 12% tax rates or things like that. So that is a pretty uniform phenomena, that decline in capital taxation, but the other social and economic policies, of course, have been highly divergent across countries. Now, all of those causal factors that I just mentioned are difficult to disentangle, and you guys are smart, you're probably already realizing that they can cause each other, and there are different ones that contribute to each other. So who do we really blame if we try to figure this out? And while I think that's a useful question to try to apportion blame, what I'm going to argue, though, is that some of these forces are very big and large, but regardless of what caused the force, the policy solution to that problem isn't always dependent on knowing what caused it. So that's part of the argument that's coming. And in particular, the notion here is that globalization and technological change are really big forces, but they're not destiny. If you look at the outcomes on the ground, for instance, of different countries and different labor markets, right? You'll see that policy institutions and social norms sort of mediate those forces into very, very different outcomes. You know, while those forces are important, you know, they're both, I would argue, highly useful, and the best we can do with policy is to sort of try to take the best parts of globalization, technological change, but sort of respond to the downsides. So in short, there's a lot going on here. Workers are generally correct to be upset, unless they're at the top, of course, and then they should be happy. But it's not clear that it's just globalization that's causing this. So what I'm going to do next is sort of talk about different types of globalization. I'm going to focus today mostly on trade and immigration, but we could talk about international business if you want in the Q&A. And I'm going to sort of take each type of globalization and ask a couple of questions. One, how responsible is it for the woes of workers? And two, would it be helpful to workers if we actually went with a less open version of those policies, for instance, erecting trade barriers or immigration restrictions, or curtailing the ability of companies to operate across borders. So let's talk about trade first. So trade is, you know, a topic I could easily spend a course on and frequently do. There are immense benefits to international trade. I don't need to tell Canada that. Canada is a much more sort of open economy than the United States. So those of you who are here, if you just sort of think about the trade ratio compared to GDP, it's actually a lot higher here than it is in many countries. And it's nice that trade comes with all of those positives, and I encourage you to sort of read about them if you want to pick up a copy of my book. But I'm going to focus today a little more on the negatives, because I think that's where people worry, right, is what is trade doing to the typical worker, right? And there's been some nice studies on this lately. There's a team of researchers out of MIT and some of their co-authors that have sort of looked at, in particular, the China shock. And what they're measuring with this China shock is really the sort of biggest surge in imports from a relatively poor country. Now, China is not as poor as it was at the beginning of the China shock. It's kind of a middle-income country now, I would argue. You know, a country with wages quite a bit lower at the time than that of rich countries was sending a vast amount of products into rich country markets. And how does that affect the labor markets in those countries? And so what these researchers do is they basically exploit geographic variation in the industries that compete with those Chinese imports. So if you look at a map, for instance, of the United States, you'd see, well, Nevada is actually pretty insulated from the China shock. Most of the workers in Nevada aren't competing directly with Chinese imports. I guess they don't sell casinos and things like that. But there are other states, for instance, in the Deep South, where there are pockets that are very, that specialize in industries that are very competitive against the Chinese imports. And what these researchers find is that the entry of China into the WTO and the sort of expansion of Chinese imports cost the US economy, and they sort of aggregate up, and about 2 million jobs over that period. And so that sounds like a lot, but we have to remember the US economy is big, right? But I'll give you some perspective on that in a second. Now, this aggregation question is a little interesting, right? Because it's not entirely clear you can say, okay, well, we lost a few jobs in this part of Mississippi and this part of Louisiana and this part of Pennsylvania, and add them all up and say, well, that's the total job loss. Because we also think other things are probably changing at the same time. If there's more job loss in some parts of the country, the central bank might pursue looser monetary policy. Or inexpensive Chinese imports could actually make other industries thrive, because maybe they're using the Chinese steel to make a more competitive cutlery business, for instance, or so forth, right? So we're not counting any of those positives, we're just focusing on the negatives here. But I would say even another point that's even more important to keep in mind before we sort of take those 1 to 2 million jobs and sort of use that as an excuse for concluding that trade is highly problematic is how much job loss there just is in general in a big economy like the United States. So if you look at a typical quarter in the United States, there are about 6 million jobs that are lost, which means a typical year we've got over 20 million jobs being lost in the US economy. Now you might be like, how is that possible? Well, there's over 20 million jobs typically get created in the US economy too, right? And so the net of those two things are the job numbers that you see government bureaucrats reporting on a regular basis. So you may not see those in the aggregate numbers because they net out, but there's an incredible amount of churn in a big capitalist economy and a small capitalist economy. In any capitalist economy, there's a lot of job loss and a lot of job creation. And this generates a lot of disruption, but I would point out that 1 to 2 million over a stretch of years is just kind of a drop in the bucket to all this other kind of disruption too, right? It's also harmful to lose your job to a robot. It's harmful to lose your job to Walmart when they come to town and then your little mom and pop shop closes. It's hard to lose your job because people no longer want the good you're producing, right? All of those job losses are hard. And it's also hard to lose them due to Chinese imports, but it's important to keep in mind there's a larger picture here. There have also been some nice studies, if you're interested, that you could sort of look at the change in production patterns in Canada due to trade with the United States, particularly following a couple of the free trade agreements, so the Canada-US free trade agreement, which went into effect in 1989. And what you see in that case is you see a lot of plant closure and a lot of plant expansion, right? And one of the reasons that those shocks are actually a little less disruptive than the Chinese version is that some of the plants that are closing and the plants that are expanding are actually in the same industry, right? So you've got the less productive auto plants shutting, but more productive auto plants expanding and then hiring some of the people that lost the jobs in that same industry. So that type of trade tends to be a little bit less disruptive than the trade that threatens an entire industry. It's just sort of a reorientation and efficiency gain of sort of the scale of plants. Now, you could argue that, okay, Kim, so there's a lot of job loss. It's caused by lots of different things, but there's only so much we can really do. Like, we can't stop the march of the robots. Social norms are hard to change. Market power is politically entrenched. But what we can do is we can stop imports, and in fact, it's pretty easy. Countries do it all the time. Like in the early parts of the 20th century, lots of countries decided to be less global by raising tariffs, right? And they reduced substantially their exposure to international trade. So it's a policy option that's completely available and attainable. And so the question next is, would reducing trade actually benefit workers in rich countries if they decided to do that? And I apologize, I just sort of take the rich country perspective in this book because there's only so much you can do in one book. I thought about trying to write like a defense of globalization for the Globe, right? But then it would get like 3 volumes or whatever. So that's next maybe. So the question is, what does it help rich country workers if we restrict trade? And my answer to this is no, and I'll point out that I wrote this book before we ran the experiment in the United States. I will say a little bit about timing of when this book was written at the end. But you can see actually from the recent tariffs in the United States, several of the sort of reasons why tariffs ultimately harm workers. The first, it creates a new set of shocks, right? We talked about the shocks associated with the wave of Chinese imports. It's hard to just go undo a shock that's already happened, right? It's like Paul Krugman tells the joke about a motorist that runs someone over and thinks they're going to undo it by putting it into reverse, right? You can't lessen damage necessarily or undo things that have already happened, but it is pretty easy to make new shocks, right? And if you look at the tariffs in the United States, they've done that. For instance, in the upper Midwest, lots of soybean farmers are really distressed because the retaliation to the US tariffs was to raise tariffs on US soybeans. And so those soybean farmers have really suffered economically. General Motors paid $1 billion extra in tariffs due to increased tariffs on imported intermediate products. To give you some perspective, there's been a strike recently with General Motors workers. That's cost General Motors so far estimated about $1.5 billion, but that's a month of workers not working, right? The tariffs themselves got to 2/3 that cost just from a handful of products. As you know, General Motors has closed plants in the Midwest, and one of the reasons that they've done that is because U.S. production is less cost-effective than it used to be when input goods are more expensive. And many companies have announced sort of lower profits or even layoffs due to the trade wars and uncertainty. And in fact, the first business that I noticed going bankrupt because of the tariffs was actually a steel company, ironically enough, because the steel tariffs are a really big deal in the United States. But it was a steel company that began with imported scrap metal, right, and then used that to make a more finished steel product, and they couldn't pay the tariffs for the imported scrap metal, so laid off hundreds of workers in Louisiana and I believe Tennessee. So that's one danger, right, is that with the tariffs you just introduce a new set of shocks, either due to retaliation or due to the fact that companies rely on imported intermediate products and are less productive if they're more expensive. But trade restrictions also hurt workers in their role as consumers, and this is important to remember. So a tariff is a consumption tax, right? So it falls just on your consumption, and it falls just on your consumption of imported products. And if you look at tariffs throughout history and across countries, they disproportionately burden the poor relative to the rich, in part because they're a consumption tax, right? And the rich can save some of their income, so they don't pay consumption tax on that part. And in part because countries in their infinite policy wisdom, and I say that sarcastically, have often put disproportionately high tariffs on cheap products, right, or things that the poor would tend to buy. So for instance, if you look in the United States, the percent tariff on a cashmere sweater is much lower than the percent tariff on a t-shirt. The percent tariff on plastic footwear is higher than the percent tariff on Italian leather shoes, right? So the pattern of protection, and this isn't unique to just the United States, tends to disproportionately harm the poor too. So we've got this regressive consumption tax in an environment where workers' wages aren't really doing that well. It doesn't seem to me that that's the ideal policy response. And if you look back in history, one of the reasons that countries moved away from tariffs and towards income taxes was in part an attempt to make the tax system fair, because it was widely recognized that tariffs weren't really burdening the rich. A final way in which tariffs hurt workers is they harm international relations. And if you think international relations are incidental to workers, you should probably stop and think a little bit about that, right? So sometimes when I make this argument, people are like, well, why do workers care about international relations? Well, here's a couple, right? Like, if you go to war with a country, like, who's fighting in that? It's not the rich people, right? The soldiers tend to be disproportionately poor. But think about problems like climate change, right? This is our biggest market failure that I'm aware of, and certainly in my lifetime. We rely on international cooperation to address climate change. Lately, when we've had meetings of the G7 or G20 countries, people have gotten together and they've talked about trade wars, right? When they should be talking about, international common interests like addressing climate change and security threats and the like, they're instead talking about these trade spats. So it's not trivial for countries to get along, and trade is one way in which they can do that, but trade wars are one way that kind of harm the ability of countries to sort of see their common interest. And I would also say it's important to remember that global market access has been like a force for serious good in helping poor countries alleviate poverty. I think really one of the most hopeful economic stories in all of human history has been the massive decrease in extreme poverty over this last generation. So let's stop and be happy about that for a second. If you go back to 1980, about 40% of the world's population lived below the World Bank poverty line, which is $1.90 a day, right? So that's a pretty low poverty line, and 40% of the world lived below that. At present, less than 10% do, slightly less than 10%, but still less than 10%. And there's been a particularly steep decrease in poverty in countries like China and India that have also benefited from openness to the world's ideas in international trade. I would point out that poverty reduction has been matched by gains in life expectancy, by improvements in child mortality, by reductions in illiteracy. It's not just GDP growing up, it's a wholehearted improvement, right? Now, openness is not everything. You know, it's not like you could take a poor country and say trade, and then now you won't be poor anymore. But I guess my point is it's a little hard to imagine China or India achieving quite so much if they tried to do it in a more autarkic way of saying, like, okay, we're going to be self-reliant, we're going to get all our information here, we're not going to take ideas or foreign capital, we're not going to import intermediate goods. You know, I think that's a recipe for being more like North Korea, right? And that's less helpful. One thing to note is that the gains of those poor countries have really not come at the expense of the rich countries as a whole in GDP terms, right? If you look at that same period where those countries, where the poor countries were growing a lot, and it's not just China and India, there are others too that have had substantial growth, but the China and Indian examples are most important because that's where, 2.6 billion people live. But if you look at their gains, they've happened together with GDP growth occurring in most of the rich countries. So for instance, if you look at the United States, there's been, over that same period, enough extra GDP that if it were spread evenly across the population, every American citizen could have over 60% more purchasing power, right? Now, it wasn't spread evenly. That's a problem. But the point is, the poor countries growing didn't stop the United States or Canada from growing, right? Both of those economies did very well over the last generation. And by the way, trade deficits and surpluses have nothing to do with the gains from trade. I'm just going to assert that, but if you want to know more about that, there's a really friendly treatment of that topic in chapter 6 of the book, but we can also talk about it in Q&A. But trade deficits and trade surpluses are really about which countries are borrowing, the deficit ones, or lending, the surplus ones. It's nothing to do with trade barriers. And if you look at economies that have higher trade barriers, they tend to actually have worse trade balances, not better ones, if you just look at the raw data. Okay, so the summary bullet points on trade is, yes, this can be totally disruptive, for sure. But in general, it makes economies better off, right? And restricting trade, while it sounds like a promising way to restrict disruption, can actually make things worse for workers by acting as a regressive consumption tax, by lowering the number of partners you have in the world to deal with problems, and by creating brand new shocks that you didn't have before. Okay, so that's the trade story in a nutshell. Let's talk a bit about immigration. The great thing about immigration is it's just like an easier story. We don't even have to talk very much about the downsides because there are very few of them. And the upsides are even bigger. The efficiency gains are larger. It's just like a super hopeful story. And chapter 8 of my book is about immigration. It's by far my favorite chapter because it's not an area where I was originally an expert, but I read just like a zillion papers to read it. And my hunch going into writing that chapter was that I kind of liked immigrants in general. I just thought they were great. But I expected to learn some bad things, like here and there, a study or two. And it was like the research was even better than I thought it was in terms of how awesome immigrants are. So that was delightful. Okay, so if you look at the hundreds of economic studies or summaries of the hundreds of economic studies that luckily there are National Academies of Sciences reports and things like that on that, it's very difficult to find any serious evidence that immigration is responsible for the woes of workers. There have been many, many studies. The picture is clear. Immigrants are good for the country. They're good for almost every group in the country. Immigration is good for the immigrants themselves, who tend to do well by immigrating. And there are just very few losers in the story. To the extent that you can find losers in the immigration story, it tends to be either prior waves of immigrants whose wages are slightly depressed by the new immigrants, or teenagers who might see, again, slight depression of their wages in some sectors in the US case. If you look at the United States, immigrants are about 14% of the population. In Canada, they're 22% of the population at present. Immigrants, as you know, are far from evenly spread out. They tend to cluster in particular areas. So in the United States, California is 27% immigrant, whereas Montana is 2% immigrant, right? In Canada, Toronto is a city with almost half foreign-born population, I believe, which is much higher, of course, than the Canadian average. So, depending on your perspective, some people feel there's too many immigrants, but if you sort of look at the places, at least in the United States, where people hold those views most strongly, it tends to ironically be the places where there are very few immigrants. So it's like, yeah, sure they don't like them in, the places where they aren't, but places where they are, among native workers, they tend to, be quite happy. But there has been a big backlash against immigration in the United States that's taken the form of the Trump administration. And the wall is just one part of his, shall we say, strategy. There are also increased, vetting and obstacles for legal immigrants, reduced refugee quotas, and just sort of hurtful rhetoric. In the United Kingdom, restricting immigration was a big impetus for the Brexit movement. Even in Canada, there have been divides surrounding this issue, and if you look at polling data, there's a substantial minority of Canadians, about 38%, who view immigrants as a burden. So, there are folks who wish there were less immigration. But let me tell you, there's some serious dangers from restricting immigration, and here's 4. One, receiving countries will lose talent and innovation. Immigrants are disproportionately studying in fields where we have skill shortages. For instance, computer science and engineering, they're half of US graduate students in those areas. Immigrants disproportionately win Nobel Prizes, it turns out, which is kind of a cool fact. If you look at the United States, for instance, I told you that immigrants are 13–14% of the population. They're a little over half of our Nobel Prize winners in scientific fields. So that's an impressive statistic. So that's one loss. You sort of lose the sort of talent innovation that comes with immigration. A second loss is you lose entrepreneurship and business creation. And this is an important one because when you think about immigration, people often think about it as labor moving. Right? And so in a way, it should be competition for the labor that's already there if more labor comes in. But if the labor that comes in founds businesses and hires labor, then it's not just labor supply, right? It's also labor demand, right? And so this gives you reason to think that, it may not be that much of a threat to workers. As examples, 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by an immigrant or an immigrant's child. About half of US billion-dollar startups had an immigrant on their founding team. Immigrants disproportionately found small businesses too in the United States, Germany, Canada. You can sort of see those statistics. So they're creating labor demand as well as supply. We also lose important parts of the labor force when we restrict immigration. Again, they fill key skill needs at both the higher and lower end of the spectrum. In the US case, immigrants are important in technologically sophisticated fields, but they're also important at doing agricultural field work and elder care and other jobs like that too, right? So those are important skills. And finally, there's a demographic argument for immigration. Imagine you live in Japan, right? In Japan, there are 8 retired people for every 10 workers, right? So stop and contemplate that, right? And we've promised in most rich countries that retired people get things like health insurance and retirement pensions and things that are in part state funded. And we've got 10 workers for every 8 retirees in Japan. That's a large fiscal burden. In Italy, the number is 5 retirees for every 10 workers. US and Canada have nearly identical ratios of 3 retirees for every 10 workers. We still complain about how, at least in the United States, I don't know if Canadians complain, but Americans in the United States complain all the time about like the burden of Social Security and Medicare and all these baby boomers retiring, and it's very expensive, right? But imagine how much worse it would be if we had slower population growth. Well, immigration is a really crucial response to those demographic pressures, not just because it's adding labor now, but because recent generations of immigrants have higher fertility rates than more distant generations of immigrants, right? So if you look at that, it also kind of raises your birth rate. Okay, so with all these delightful benefits, why would there be a backlash? There's 3 things that people worry about. One is, again, this idea that immigrants might act as a threat to native workers because they're competing in the same labor markets. Now, this is a theoretically complicated question, right? Because there's both supply and demand factors, as I've already alluded to. It's also an empirically difficult question. So your first instinct might be to just say, well, let's compare wage growth in California and Montana, and voila, California's doing a lot better than Montana, therefore immigrants are good. But you can't quite do it that quickly, right? Even if Toronto is booming more than some backwater place that doesn't have migrants, that doesn't mean that the migrants caused that, right? Migrants get to decide where to move, and they get to decide when to move. And if you're a migrant, you're not going to go to some place where you can't get a job, right? You're going to go to a thriving place. So this makes the empirical work in this area difficult. But occasionally, nature comes along and gives us a nice experiment. So there was this really nice opportunity for economists in 1980 when the Cuban government decided to allow emigration for a brief period of time out of the port of Mariel, right? And so there was this huge out-migration. In the city of Miami, there was an additional 120,000 residents that settled there, and the low-skilled labor force increased by about 20% overnight, right? So that's pretty darn close to a natural experiment. Like, we didn't sort of tell that Cuba to do that. You know, it just sort of happened when it did, and they went where there are other Cubans. And so it's a really nice natural experiment. And when they have done careful studies of this, and there have now been many because it's such a great experiment, and they find very little negative effect, in fact, very little effect at all on wages or job growth. There was one dissent study where George Borhaus and some of his colleagues thought they found a negative effect on African American workers in Miami, and that was exciting to them because they, you know, like to doubt this question about whether immigrants are really good for wages. But it turns out there was a sampling change in the way that the census gathered data on African Americans at that same time, and once you removed that sampling change effect, basically the negative effect went away again. And so basically the ship has sailed. Those, that boat lift did not create any negative wage gains. There have been some similar experimental studies looking at Israel with the Russian in-migration that have found similar conclusions, again for political reasons. There was a big sort of nearly exogenous depositing of labor onto the economy, and then you could sort of look and see that that didn't hurt wages. A second concern is with state and local budgets. We talked about immigrants being concentrated in particular spaces, and if they are low-skill immigrants, you might worry that they would use more budget resources than they pay in taxes. And this, at least in the United States, can be an issue if you look at that National Academies of Sciences survey where they look at kind of all of the literature and try to put it together, and they've got people from every side of the discipline kind of represented in that. They find that sort of the first generation low-skilled immigrant is costing state and local budgets about $1,500 to $1,800, depending on the study that you look. By the time they have children, that second generation migrant is actually a fiscal surplus of the same size because the children of immigrants tend to outperform the children of natives in labor markets and then pay more taxes than government spending. And high-skilled migrants don't have the fiscal burden even to begin with because they sort of start from the higher point. And finally, there are cultural concerns, and I think this is the big driver in the United States, at least. But again, the data show little reason for concern. There's no evidence that immigrants are assimilating more slowly than they used to, which is something that people sometimes worry about. There's no evidence of higher crime rates. On the contrary, they tend to be lower crime rates for documented immigrants, and even for undocumented immigrants. If anything, they're the same. And then there are also studies that show positive effects, actually, on institutional strength. So there's a lot of evidence that sort of suggests we probably are just doing fine with migration. And there's also an important moral argument that I would point out for being open to refugees. And I think that, you know, that poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty sort of says it all. You know, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, you know, that's the torch is lifted for them. You know, and I think there's a strong argument for taking in people in unfortunate political and circumstances abroad, and you know, I also think there's strong moral reason for openness there. Okay. Okay, so to recap here, we talked about immigration. The argument here is actually, I think, even stronger than with respect to trade. On net, we see lots of evidence that immigration is good for most groups in the economy, and there's very positive benefits to be had here. On immigration restrictions, on the other hand, risk harming innovation, risk harming job creation, and risk making our demographic burdens worse, right? Okay, so if we look at these types of openness, right, it seems to me that we've got a little bit of a problem because we've sort of identified that workers are really struggling, their wages aren't rising as quickly as we're expecting them to, income inequality is a big deal, but yet I'm telling you that my opinion is that tariffs, trade barriers, immigration restrictions, and the like would actually make things worse. Right, so that does leave us with a pressing question about what to do for workers. And in the last section of the book, I outlined sort of a three-category approach. One, supporting workers directly. Two, tax reform. And three, what I call a better partnership with the business community. And I'm not going to have time to go into all of this with great detail, but I'm going to give you a few examples of each idea. So first, how do you better support workers? There's really two parts of this. One is how to make sure new workers have all the tools they need to prosper in an increasingly technologically sophisticated global economy, right? And to prepare workers for the jobs of the future, you need to focus on fundamentals like education, infrastructure, research and development, and I have some examples in the book. But there's a second question, which is how do you support workers and communities in general that have been left behind, that are facing these geographically concentrated shocks, they're seeing declining opportunity and the like. And so I think that's something that we need to think hard about because it creates all sorts of social and economic problems to have concentrated economic pain. And you can see that, for instance, if you look at the map of the opioid crisis, it's not, I don't think, a pure accident of where that crisis has hit the hardest, right? It's often in places that are economically depressed. So I would suggest addressing this head-on, in part by investing in communities that have been left behind. And I think Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States actually provides a nice example. It used to be a big steel town, the Pittsburgh Steelers, you may have heard of. But it is now much more medical services and even high-tech kind of stuff happening in Pittsburgh. And what happened there is there was a partnering between local universities and governments to invest in both infrastructure and education. And that's something that I think would be a nice model to take to other cities and sort of think about how you can make those public investments. I mean, it might be tempting to just tell people to move to where the opportunities are, because there are always parts of the country that are doing better than others, wherever you are. But sometimes people don't want to do that, right? And you might think that there's other ways that we could sort of make sure that communities can be strong. I also suggest policies like wage insurance, which is something that's not been tried really on a large scale, but which there are some small models for, where you could, basically the government could help make up the difference between, say, a steel worker that lost a high wage job and then had to take a lower wage job. Some of that difference could be made up automatically in a way that would encourage work and reemployment. And then in the United States, of course, we have to work on issues like access to healthcare and education and making that more even. This is less of a Canadian problem, right? Because you already have solved some of those problems that the United States is far behind on. A second step that I think all countries should think about with today's economic challenges is making sure the tax system is sort of automatically responding to some of these challenges. And you can do this. The tax system is an incredibly powerful tool because you can create negative tax rates with it, and you can also create higher tax rates with it, and you can basically make sure that if GDP is growing, that everybody's boats are rising, a rising tide lifts all boats. You can make sure that that happens through the tax system. So what you do is you increase negative tax rates at the bottom. The U.S. has something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. You can make that more generous. Right now it's quite generous for workers with children. They can get up to $5,800 of Earned Income Tax Credit, but very sort of ungenerous for people without children. Another option is to exempt the first $20,000, say, of income from the payroll tax. You could do that, right? And it would make the tax bite at the bottom less hard. And you could also raise the cap. In the United States, there's a cap on earnings such that you could collect more revenue at the top. You can do other creative things too, but the key is to make sure you're sort of siphoning some of this GDP down the income distribution to counter this big increase in income inequality, because when there's growth, we want it to benefit, you know, the entire society in an inclusive way. This is also going to mean asking more from those at the top, right? And that includes mobile international corporations. I suggest ways to make the tax system more efficient by taxing different types of income more similarly. In the United States, we have much lower capital tax rates than labor income tax rates, and that's starting to be true for a lot of countries. But once that's true, you have this incentive to earn your income in capital form rather than labor form, and then it further erodes the tax base. So treating those more similarly can help. But we also need to modernize our corporate tax system to get better at taxing internationally mobile capital. And that's something I've basically worked 2 decades of my life on and thought about a lot. But what's really missing there, I think, is not ways to do that, because there's a lot of really good ways to modernize our corporate tax system internationally as an international community, or even as countries acting unilaterally. But what tends to be missing is political will, right? So you need to be able to stand up to the companies if you want to tax them. But this is another area where I think international cooperation can be quite helpful. And finally, at least in the United States, but less so in Canada, I think a carbon tax is long overdue. And while this can be a contentious issue, and you see a lot of people sort of politically resisting to carbon taxes, there are ways to make this much more politically palatable. For instance, you can take in the carbon tax and just hand it back as a per capita refund. And if you model what that does, if you sort of put the true price of carbon into people's calculations by putting a carbon tax of, say, $50 per metric ton or something like that in, right? But then you take all that carbon tax revenue, divide by the number of people, and hand it back, right? You end up with the bottom 70% of the population is actually better off after that. But every actor, every consumer, every business, every green energy firm now is responding to a different set of incentives. So people will fly less and they will, live closer to their jobs. But businesses will also think about green building, and greener energy sources are much more economically viable when carbon is its real price, not the fake price that we're using now. So that's what I think in terms of taxes. Now finally, in terms of a better partnership with business, I'll just note that markets work best in an environment of competition and information, right? And we've known since Adam Smith that markets work best when they're competitive, yet we don't really have that environment now. When consumers, workers, and investors have information, they make better decisions on what products to buy and where to invest and where to work. So I think a better partnership with the business community means a lot more transparency on things like labor and tax. And it also means that we're going to have to be more sensitive to sort of antitrust issues, not just in terms of how concentrated firms affect consumers, but also how they affect workers, right? And so I think those are really important pieces moving forward. Now, in some areas, such as tax, we're going to have to ask more from the business community, but I think we can also give the business community something in response, right? Businesses thrive when the middle class is strong, and businesses thrive in open economies with access to global capital and trade and the skills of immigrant populations. So by sort of pairing a set of policies that businesses really benefit from, but also asking more social responsibility, I think that's a reasonable step forward. Okay, so let me conclude with just one more thought for you today. I mean, I think these policy steps that I've described are practical, they're effective ideas that can be easily understood, that are capable of generating support from both sides of the political spectrum. But I would argue that it's particularly important to do something at this moment in time to sort of constructively respond to the needs of workers. So this book was actually written in the aftermath of the 2016 election in the United States. So I had sort of imagined that turning out differently. I was quite dismayed by the rhetoric, actually, on both the far left and the far right, that would do things like sort of hold up NAFTA as the boogeyman for all that was going wrong for American workers. And it was kind of like, And NAFTA might have hurt a few workers, but it's, probably like number 104 of things on the list, like if you wanted to make a list of things that had harmed workers. But everybody was talking about NAFTA. I think the outcome of that election reflected, a lot of factors, not just economic discontent, but economic discontent was prominent. What's really noticeable is on Inauguration Day, if you look at the speech that Trump made, he promised to put America first, right? And that theme he has held to, to justify any number of things ever since, the tariffs, the trade wars, the immigration barriers. And sadly, I would like to say that the United States is alone in this, but I see also this sort of economic nationalist mentality elsewhere. Brexit, of course, is another example. It reflected a tide of nationalism and a rejection of the EU trade and migration policies. Nationalism has been ascendant in places like Poland and Hungary and Brazil, and I could give you a long list of other places. And I would argue that that's dangerous. If you look back to the last big era of globalization, it was also accompanied by increased income inequality, and it ended with a rise in nationalism. It was followed by 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen next, but I am saying that economic discontent resulting from inequality and slow wage growth have created a situation where these sort of snake oil economic nationalism policies are more attractive than they should be. And this is dangerous to peace, but it's also dangerous to the prosperity of workers. And it distracts us from much more practical and direct ways that we could respond to our true problems. So this is a moment in history where I think it's important to get economic policy right. And at least in the United States, I know we can do a lot better than we have been. So I look forward to talking with you about any questions that you might have.
The RGCS lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies Student Fellowship. And I'll ask that people wait for the microphone to reach them so that questions can be heard on the videotape. So a question from an RGCS student fellow first, please.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I was wondering, when you propose creative tax solutions, you basically focus on income taxes most than anything. But with like Zuckman and Serraz's new proposals about wealth tax, I wanted to see what you think about that as a viable creative solution, because a lot of the problems of inequality now are entrenched because you can just reinvest your gains. So to roll back the clock, wouldn't a wealth tax be a better solution?
Yeah, so I really think they've started an excellent conversation with the wealth tax. How I would do it is slightly different in the sense that for any wealth tax rate you can pick, you can get the equivalent outcome by taxing the investment income from wealth. But the problem with doing that is that a lot of that isn't taxed until realization. And so what happens is people will hold the asset for a long time, hoping to pass it on to their heirs or to give it to charity without ever paying tax on it, right? So what I would like to see is moving to a current taxation of investment income. It doesn't seem fair to me that laborers have to pay their tax every single year, but when capital earns income, it only pays it when it's allowed to wait. And a tax deferred is a tax avoided effectively because it can grow tax-free in the meantime. So you can move to something called mark-to-market taxation, where for publicly traded equities, you sort of send them a tax bill each year. For private investments in things like artwork and real estate, where you might not have either the current price or the liquidity to handle this, what you can do is something called retrospective taxation, where you basically assign sort of an interest charge to the taxes that you would have paid earlier, right? And I would couple that with some withholding tax, based on, say, a 4% return or something, because my fear would be that if you were relying solely on the retrospective part of the taxation, then rich people would just sort of wait out the administration that wanted to tax them and then changed the law later and then realized their assets then, right? So I think you need some sort of withholding tax to go with that. And the reason I prefer the sort of taxing the income on wealth rather than the wealth is because since they can be equivalent, I think in a way there's both an efficiency argument, which is you're sort of saying that, and that one's a little hard to make really quickly, but if you earn more investment income, right, you get taxed accordingly, right? And so that goes up. Whereas wealth, we're sort of treating every type of wealth the same. But my biggest reason for it is a much more pragmatic one, which is the wealth tax is probably constitutional. Most legal scholars think it is. But most legal scholars isn't good enough. Because I don't want our one chance of taxing the rich to come down to the judgment of John Roberts, right, who's the swing vote often on the US Supreme Court. So if it were up to me, and again, it's not, but I would advise that people who are serious about taxing the rich, if they're going to do a wealth tax, at least have a provision that a slightly higher rate version of the investment income tax would go into effect if it's ruled unconstitutional, right, as a backup, right? Because I worry very much that this will just get dragged out in court battles for a long period of time due to that ambiguity. Whereas if you do the mark-to-market or the retrospective version, arguably the constitutional problems are much, much smaller. Yeah.
Hi, so thank you for your speech. You focused mainly on the positives of immigration to the receiving country, but my question has to do sort of with the flip side of that. So when people are leaving a country in large numbers, particularly if it's a poor country, what are the negative effects that has on that society? Are they losing talent, for example? Are they losing the potential for job creation?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and there's a really nice paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on this that is something like 8 questions about brain drain or something like that. And what they find is that it's a little more ambiguous than you might think, because you might think, okay, well, if the United States or Canada is getting the world's talent and somebody else is losing the world's talent, right? Like, so that seems sort of zero-summish. But there's several channels in which the immigration or emigration from the perspective of the home country can actually help. One is remittances, right? So if you look, for instance, at India or Mexico, you see that both of those countries receive a sizable share of GDP in remittances from Indian and Mexican immigrants who are sending money back, right? And because the wage differentials are so large from the origin country to the destination country, migrants can often afford to send huge fractions of their wages back while still feeling a lot better off by moving. There's also a sort of a competition effect, which is, let's say there's a limited number of visas or a limited number of people who can leave, right? And you want to get the visa, right? Then it could also encourage sort of investment in education to try to be the one to, to benefit from that. And then there's empirical evidence. You could sort of look, is it the case that countries that have received, who have sent more healthcare workers abroad, do they have worse healthcare outcomes, and studies like that. And in general, while the brain drain concern is real, I think the evidence is pretty nuanced on this. There's not a lot of evidence of dramatic negative effects on other countries, and there are these positive mechanisms through both the competition and the remittance channel. So if you're interested in that topic, I really recommend that 8 questions about brain drain paper. It's in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and it has citations to many, many, many studies. So you could sort of, you don't need to take my word for it, you can go and look at the evidence. But I think it's less negative than you would think, and generally positive, and sometimes largely so. So in the Indian case, for instance, I think you can make the argument that the out-migration has ultimately been good for India. And a final mechanism which can be helpful is sort of strengthens ties between the two countries, right? So there's more trade and investment flows in both directions after the migration, and so that can be useful too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Back on the topic of taxation, I know another hot button issue in taxation is intergenerational intergenerational wealth transfers and passing it on. And I know in Canada, one thing that makes us different than the States is we don't have an estate tax, where the States does, I believe.
That's correct, we do. It's getting weaker every year, but every year. But at the federal level, if you have more than 11 million, that's when it starts in your estate. And some U.S. states start too.
Sorry.
But go ahead, yeah.
I'm just wondering in general if you can comment on estate tax and if you think that's an effective way of targeting wealth.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. If it were up to me, it would be much more robust. I think what happened to make it weaker was a marketing effort that focused on it as a death tax. And so I have a marketing solution to that, which is we could call it the Paris Hilton tax. And just sort of say it's really a tax on the heirs, not on the person who died, right? Because they're going to get a smaller inheritance. And when we think about the incentive effects of that, they're good, right? They'll have to work harder. They'll have to save more themselves, right? They won't be able to just rely on mommy and daddy with their checkbook, right? And so I think there's an argument that you don't get to own your stuff after you're dead, right? And that the society that you were made that fantastic amount of wealth in has some claim on that too. Particularly when you look at the sort of, fantastic wealth of someone like Zuckerberg, for instance. And he and his wife, as I understand it, have promised to give away a lot of that wealth. But I think one incentive to encourage people to give away wealth is a robust inheritance tax. And so I'm not saying all of it. Like, I think there should be some exemption for, farms, small businesses, and, the first few million maybe. But for the sort of billionaire-style wealth, yeah, I would be definitely in favor of a very large inheritance tax. It's hard to discourage something after someone has passed, right? So the argument, to be fair to the other side, the argument against it is that there's this notion that in order to leave money to their children, that's what's driving the wheels of industry. And frankly, I just don't buy it. I don't think that we're going to have a lot less entrepreneurship and innovation because the bequest motive will be diminished. And so, yeah, and I don't think this economic studies suggest that there's, big effects. But it's a little hard to find that because there are big lags involved in studying the inheritance tax because the regime goes into effect, right? And then you may not actually be subject to the regime for a long time, right? So what am I assuming now when I make job decisions and savings decisions about how I'll be taxed when I die, right? I mean, it could be any way. I don't know what it's going to be like, right? So it's a little hard to study.
Hi, thank you very much for coming in to speak today.
Yeah.
I had a question about NAFTA and whether the benefits of trade can be realized even if barriers aren't surrendered unilaterally. So Canada, as you mentioned, is relatively open compared to other nations in the perspective of trade, yet with the barriers that do exist, for example, in poultry and the dairy industry, these seem to be things that in the NAFTA negotiations or negotiations with the United States, Canada's relatively unwilling to give up. And with the perspective of NAFTA's effect on Mexico, where even when they opened up relieved their barriers of trade to the United States and opened that border, their agricultural industry was competing with a heavily subsidized American agricultural industry, which created challenges of its own.
Yes.
So my question is, if the barriers to trades, be it subsidies or tariffs, are not surrendered unilaterally between partners, can the benefits from that trade still exist for a partner that, within this agreement, that isn't actually giving up those protections?
Yeah, and agriculture is a good example of this because for whatever reason, and I think it's sentimentality in part, rich countries are very generous to their farmers, right? So this is true in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan. The farmers are actually a pretty small number of people these days, so it's not entirely clear why they've captured our imagination as much as they have, although I'm a descendant of farmers, so I should probably be super excited about subsidizing them, but I'm not. So the larger question that you asked, yes, if you exempt an entire sector, it's still helpful, because at least the other sectors can make decisions and siphon resources towards the industries that you naturally have a comparative advantage in. So if you imagine, for instance, that we took an extreme version of the Trump tariffs and we just sort of said, okay, we're going to prohibit imports, right? What would happen in the United States is we'd have to start making things like T-shirts and car tires and a lot of products that we've stopped making. And to make those things in a country with an unemployment rate of 3.5%, you'd have to get workers from other sectors. So there'd be fewer Hollywood movies and there'd be fewer Boeing airplanes, and some of those other sectors would have to shrink so that we could make things like tires and T-shirts. And so economists tend to think it would be ideal if countries specialize in what they're relatively good at, right? And the market would, left to its own devices, should generate that. But there's a lot of places where policymakers refuse to be, put in line by that logic. And it's not just agriculture. Commercial aircraft is another one where. There's this sort of global duopoly in large aircraft, and then there's also a global duopoly in the regional aircraft. And in all four cases, Boeing, Airbus, Bombardier, and Embraer, I believe, the government is heavily involved, right? So this is not like laissez-faire, right? And it's partly the scale of the industry, that sort of almost begs that, but everybody wants to be the one making the planes. I get it, because planes are cool, at least. Like, I see that argument. But, it's tricky. So once you get the distortions from those subsidies, you're no longer sure if it really is the EU and the US and Canada and Brazil who should be making all the planes. Maybe there's another country who could do it better. Like, we don't know.
All right, so going back to the topic of immigration in general, both Canada and the US have historically had different approaches, with the US preferring family reunification while Canada's got a point system.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, do different types of immigrants bring out different economic benefits to host country?
Yes. So I think the economic argument would be that Canada's is the better system because that there's a lot of evidence that high-skilled migrants are particularly useful. But I'm kind of, in the book, what I argue for is some of everything. Because I don't think, so the point system, I see the argument economically, right? So the poem at the Statue of Liberty, instead of saying, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, yearning to be free, it could say, give me your PhD scientist, the elite of your glittering shores. There's an argument, a self-interested way for that, but I also think there's a moral argument for being open to more of the peoples of the world. And I think family reunification is itself a nice thing if parents can be with children, if spouses can be together. I think family reunification is a little less compelling to me, at least when I imagine siblings or people that are kind of further out, but I've been told that other people have conceptions of the family that are more inclusive, right? So my basic answer is, like, why not have more of all of them? Because there's a lot of evidence that immigrants are good, right? The high-skilled ones. But there's a lot of evidence that the low-skilled ones are also filling important needs and end up having children who become high-skilled ones, right? So you can get some people to pick fruit, and then their kids go to Carnegie Mellon, and the next thing you know, you've got another Fortune 500 company. And that happens a lot. There's some interesting literature about the children of immigrants, and I've noticed this in my classroom. Children of immigrants, on average, and I know that we can't just say that this is true for everything. They're really high-achieving people, right? And I think I kind of know why. It's their parents have just done so much, right, to get them to the place that they are, that they feel this sort of like sense of moral obligation. And I do think that drives them to incredible heights. And if you look at the literature, actually, there's a nice study that shows that in communities that have a lot of immigrant children, actually the native-born people perform better too, right? Because there are these sort of spillover effects through the school system and the like, right? Where you're like, oh, well, they're trying really hard. I guess I should learn calculus as a junior too. So that kind of thing. So I'm kind of in favor of all of the above. Yeah.
Hi, so thanks for a very interesting presentation, and I am going to ask the question you've probably been hinting about with respect to global capital mobility. So obviously you have the whole story about how, this impedes the ability of various governments or jurisdictions to actually make policy. It produces competition for lower tax rates, and so on and so on. You've suggested there might be even unilateral tax solutions to this, so I'm wondering what those are, and how they would work, particularly in this context where, you do have policy competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are really important questions. And I'll just say a word about global capital mobility, too. From the perspective of a rich country like the United States or Canada, the global capital markets more generally can be a really efficient way to borrow and lend and all of that. I'm not making an argument that every poor country should have unfettered, open international capital mobility, because if you take that sort of too far and they don't have the financial institutions and regulations to use that capital well, you can subject sort of poor countries to overly volatile cycles of money coming in and crashing and the like. So that's not the argument I'm making. But if you turn to this question about how to tax multinational companies, if you want to do it unilaterally, there are a couple of options. One is you could have a minimum tax, and the US has one now. It's a pretty weak one, but you could imagine a stronger version of that, where you basically say, okay, wherever you earn your income, if you're a US multinational company, if you haven't paid to that government at least 25%, say, then we get to collect it. And that's called a per country minimum. What we have right now is a global minimum, which is ask a multinational company, how much did you earn on the planet? How much tax did you pay on the planet? If that isn't at least half the US rate, then the US will tax you. But what that has is some strange incentive effects, because it basically encourages companies to blend the low tax and high tax foreign income to just hit that minimum rate, which is half the US rate, and half of something is still half of something, right? So you'd still rather have the income abroad than at home. So it was a bizarre format for that minimum tax. But if you did it at a per country level, and if you raise the rate higher, that can be a very effective unilateral solution. The argument against that is, well, if you're just applying that to your multinationals, which are really the ones that you should be applying it to, then companies would have incentive to headquarter elsewhere. I do think there are actually some really easy, if you had the political will, ways to stop that. We've had some inversion regulations in the late Obama administration that were quite effective at shutting down inversions. You could strengthen those even more. You can have a management and control test, where if the company is managed and controlled in your country, it is yours regardless, and the like. Multilaterally, the OECD, which is the rich country club, and the G20, which is the big country club, are working on solutions to sort of think about a system that might, and they've got a pretty complicated template right now, but that might let you apportion the global income of multinational companies. And I've argued in the past about a formulary apportionment system, which is what Canada uses for provinces and what the US uses for states, where we don't ask, a company like Nike who's in Oregon, we don't say, well, what were your income and expenses in Oregon? We say, well, what were the expenses in the country? And then we apportion some fraction of it to Oregon. And so there's no incentive to shift the income to Washington, where there's a lower tax rate, because you can't do it. It's like the formula speaks for itself. You can do that internationally. You could have companies just report their global income to the tax authorities, and then you'd assign it to different countries based on their true economic activities. So you could take both supply and demand side things. You could take sales and you could take employment, say, and you could use that so that if a company had about half of their activity in Canada, then half of their global tax base would be Canadian. That system works best with some international cooperation, but actually this, if it weren't for a couple of administrations that I could think of, this wouldn't be such a bad time to make that international cooperation happen in, say, a couple of years, because there's a lot of incentive in the EU to address this problem, because they have a pretty fierce version of this tax competition problem within the EU, because several EU members are havens, including Luxembourg and Ireland. I'm not scared to call them out. And so, that has slowed down progress in the EU, but you could imagine with some partner countries making more progress on this. And there's a reason for countries like China, for instance, to be interested in joining this effort too, because this is a true sort of global problem, tax competition, much like climate change. And if countries can work together on sort of setting the rules, then everybody can sort of set their own rate independently, but then they already know which part of the global tax base they get to tax. And I think that would be a really nice solution.
I should get the microphone over to the other side of the room, but on the way, political will.
Yes.
Political will is to a political scientist what assume a can opener is to an economist. If policy is endogenous to politics and politics is endogenous to economic distribution, then it might be that lots of the moments when you're saying, if it were up to me, if we had the political will, are rendered politically impossible by the prior economic changes. Let's have lots of growth and then tax and redistribute it. Well, if lots of growth involves lots of churn, even if wages go up, churn is bad for unionization. Bad for unionization is bad for the more egalitarian side of politics because unions are an important source of political energy. Let's generate momentary windfall billion-dollar fortunes, which then next year we'll get around to taxing. Well, with $1 billion, you gain political power, and loss aversion means you'll invest that political power in making sure that it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
Is there a politically coherent alternative to the political will magic wand as a story for making this happen?
Yeah, so that's chapter 12 of the book, actually. So my conclusion, I am not a political scientist and I don't play one on TV, but I did have some suggestions for starting points. And again, this is from an admittedly American perspective, but I think campaign finance reform is long overdue in the United States, and that's sort of the sort of evil root of a lot of these problems. If you sort of look at almost every horrible thing from the NRA on, you know, like a lot of it comes from the way that we finance campaigns, which is really unhelpful. I think voting reform would be really useful, and this is one weird thing that Oregon gets right, along with Pinot Noir and a few others. But in Oregon, you get mailed your ballot. You have a month to, roughly, it seems like a month, maybe it's just a few weeks to look at it, and you can deposit it in any library or mail it back, or some other government places too. And this is vastly encourages voting. We have much higher turnout in Oregon than in places where you have to go and wait in some line to express yourself. And I think it's a great tragedy that voting occurs on a Tuesday and a work day. You know, like imagine you're like a single parent with a job and your decision is whether you get to express yourself politically or get home in time to make someone dinner. You know, like, so I think that voting reform is an important element of this too. I think how we get our information is something to think about. When I was a kid and politics were more functional, because I'm, you know, pushing 50, you know, Democrats and Republicans used to work together on legislation. They used to care about governing, you know, like, well, you know, into my teen years. And I think part of it is we had a narrative that was much more similar across the parties. Like there were 4 television stations you could turn the channel to, and they all kind of told you the same facts. You know, like, so you may have liked or not liked the Vietnam War, but you knew how many soldiers died that day. It wasn't like one person was like, well, nobody died, and another person was like, 1,000 people died. You're like, I mean, so what it feels like now is we've got a slightly dysfunctional information system where everybody privately curates on the internet exactly what information they want to hear. And so I think that's a problem. I don't have a great solution to that problem aside from sort of like we need to take seriously the sort of like public good aspects of information and improve how people are getting their information, and educate young people about ways to make sure the information you're getting online is accurate. You know, like I think, so I talk about stuff like that in that final chapter, but you know, I think political engagement is crucial, and sometimes I actually think to say something cheerful after your sad sort of question, I do think that, you know, post-adversity can be a time of political momentum and change. You know, like I noticed my daughter, who was a college student last year, is now graduated, but she and her friends were very active in the 2018 midterms. She worked for a campaign, she knocked on doors in the state of Minnesota, right, to try to flip a congressional district seat. I have a harder time imagining that happen in a context where they didn't get what they wanted. where they got what they wanted. The fact that they didn't get what they wanted sort of caused a certain amount of energy politically and really led to a lot more turnout in that election. So occasionally, not getting what you want can lead to moments of protest and coalescing of movements. And again, I'm not a political scientist, but maybe there's some silver lining there. I don't know. Yeah.
Last question for Peter.
Thank you for your talk. So I couldn't agree more with you that free trade grows the pie and that barriers to trade shrink the pie. So based on that observation, it would be tempting to say, well, trade lifts all boats. We tick the box and we move on. But as you acknowledged in your talk, there's a problem, and that is that the extra growth of the pie is unequally distributed.
Yes.
Right? And so that draws our attention to one relevant counterfactual. It would be very nice to have that extra piece of the pie, but have it more equally distributed. Right? So how do we do that? Well, that brings us back to the beginning of your talk. Reduce the power of capital, right? And that labor capital share that you were talking about. Now, in response to Aberdeen, you already mentioned the kind of fiscal lever we have on that. But redistribution is always costly. So are there any measures that you see that would allow us to reduce the power of capital through other policy levers other than fiscal ones?
Yes, so I think there are definitely things to be done there. There are things that I probably know a little less about, but for instance, in the realm of labor law, it seems to me quite clear that our labor laws were written for a different era in most countries, and they don't really address things like Uber drivers and people who sell things out of their online store and the like, and so we might think about how we might better modernize labor law to sort of empower workers in the economy. And I think service sector jobs, in order for them to be good jobs, probably need more organization. And I think that if I were sort of a labor leader, I would be focusing on how to organize these service jobs to make those jobs good jobs, right? Because it's not going to be the case that we're going to return to an economy where manufacturing is a big deal, right? But it could be the case where some of these low-wage service jobs become less bad jobs. And I think one way to do it is to just pay them more through negative tax rates. But another way to do it is to sort of try to shift the power of those groups of workers, right, toward more effective negotiations with their employers, and I do think there's people who are much more expert than I in this area who are working on sort of thinking about how to come up with satisfying answers to those questions. There have been some political candidates who've suggested also steps like putting workers on boards and stock ownership sharing and the like. I'm a little bit worried about the stock ownership sharing simply because an employee is already really subject to their employer's risk for their job, right? If they also have all their retirement in that company's stock, right, then I worry, like, now the General Motors worker loses their job at a time where General Motors stock is also going down, right? And all their savings are in GM stock. So I guess what I'd rather see are maybe ways to encourage employers to transfer, to open, more generous 401ks and things for their employees, so that their employees become capitalists, but diversified capitalists, rather than ones that are just owning part of that company. Because I think there is some concern that you're putting all your eggs in one basket.
Please join me in thanking Kimberly Klassen.